My 6-year-old daughter looked at me over breakfast one morning and asked, completely innocently, why I was trying to replace Miss Renata, a question that made no sense until I understood, over the following weeks, that our nanny of 2 years had been quietly rewriting the story of our family from the inside, one small comment at a time. While simultaneously moving nearly $90,000 out of accounts she was never supposed to have unsupervised access to in the first place. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how completely a trusted caregiver can reshape a family's internal reality without anyone noticing until the damage runs far deeper than anyone could have anticipated. My husband David and I hired Renata almost exactly 2 years before everything fell apart. After an extensive search process that included background checks, multiple reference calls, and a trial period we took seriously precisely because we understood how much trust we were extending to whoever ultimately came into our home to help care for our two young children, Emma, who was 4 at the time, and Lucas, who was just 18 months old. Renata came to us with genuinely excellent references, having worked with 2 previous families for a combined 9 years, both of whom spoke glowingly about her reliability, her warmth with children, and her professionalism. She was, in those early months, and honestly for most of the 2 years she worked with us, exactly what those references had promised: patient, engaged, creative with the kids in ways that genuinely enriched their daily lives. The kind of caregiver who remembered small details about each child's preferences and fears, who showed up consistently, who we both, David and I, came to trust implicitly with increasingly significant responsibility as our family's needs grew more complex. By the time this story really begins, roughly 18 months into Renata's employment with us, we'd expanded her role considerably beyond the original childcare arrangement. Both David and I worked demanding jobs. I managed operations for a growing healthcare startup. David worked as a partner at a regional law firm, and Renata had, over time, become something closer to a household manager than a traditional nanny, handling not just the children's daily care, but grocery shopping, coordinating household repairs, and eventually, at David's suggestion during a particularly demanding stretch for both of our careers, managing several routine household bills and expenses through a joint account we set up specifically for that purpose, giving her direct access to handle recurring payments without needing to constantly involve either of us in every small administrative decision. I want to be honest that this decision, in hindsight, was the single moment that made everything that followed possible, though at the time it felt like a completely reasonable extension of trust we'd already built over 18 months of consistently excellent, reliable work. We set the account up with what felt like appropriate safeguards: a monthly spending cap, automatic notifications for any transaction above a certain threshold, regular monthly reconciliation that David, primarily, was responsible for reviewing. The problem, we would later understand, was that David's review process had become increasingly cursory over the following months, a casualty of his own demanding schedule and the accumulated trust that made careful scrutiny feel almost insulting to someone who had proven herself so reliable for so long. He'd glance at the monthly statement, note that the total spending seemed roughly in line with expectations, and move on, rarely examining individual line items with the kind of careful attention that might have caught what was actually happening much earlier than we eventually did. The financial diversion, once we finally understood its full scope, had apparently started small, roughly 14 months into Renata's employment. Modest discrepancies between actual grocery receipts and the amounts charged to the household account, small enough individually that they blended seamlessly into the ordinary variation of weekly shopping trips. Over the following 10 months, the scale gradually increased, incorporating fabricated repair invoices for household maintenance that either never happened or cost significantly less than what was charged to our account, along with a pattern of cash withdrawals framed, in the brief notes she'd logged for our reference, as covering miscellaneous kids' activities and supplies, that became increasingly vague and increasingly frequent as the months progressed. By the time this all came to light, Renata had diverted just over $87,000 from accounts specifically meant to cover household and childcare expenses, an amount that, spread carefully across nearly a year of gradually escalating discrepancies, had somehow remained beneath the threshold of obvious alarm throughout the entire period. I want to explain the specific moment everything started to unravel, because it happened in a way I never would have anticipated, through my daughter Emma rather than through any financial discrepancy David or I might have eventually caught through our own review process. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning. David already gone to an early meeting, Emma eating cereal across from me while I scrolled through emails on my phone, half present the way parents often are during rushed morning routines. Emma looked up at me, with the particular directness young children sometimes deploy without any awareness of how loaded their questions can land, and asked, "Mommy, why are you trying to replace Miss Renata?" I remember setting my phone down slowly, genuinely confused by the question. "What do you mean, sweetheart? Nobody's trying to replace Miss Renata. She said you might get a new nanny because she's worried you don't like how she takes care of us anymore," Emma said, her small face carrying a worry that seemed entirely genuine, entirely absorbed from somewhere. "She said if that happens, we probably won't get to see her anymore, and I don't want a new nanny. I want Miss Renata." I sat with that conversation for the rest of the day, an uneasy feeling building steadily as I turned it over in my mind. David and I had never discussed replacing Renata, had never expressed anything but continued satisfaction with her work during any conversation Emma could have possibly overheard. Where had this specific, detailed worry come from, delivered with enough emotional weight that my 4-year-old, by then, Emma had turned 5, closer to 6, had clearly been carrying it internally for some time before finally voicing it to me directly. I began paying closer attention over the following weeks, watching interactions between Renata and the kids with a kind of attentiveness I hadn't consciously deployed in a long time, trusting, as I had for nearly 2 years, that her competent, warm care didn't require ongoing scrutiny. What I started noticing, once I was actually looking for it, unsettled me in ways I struggled to fully articulate even to myself. There was a moment, about a week after Emma's initial comment, when I came home earlier than expected from a shortened workday and overheard Renata talking to Emma in the kitchen, unaware I'd entered the house quietly enough not to interrupt. "Your mommy works so much," Renata was saying, her voice gentle, almost sympathetic in tone. "It's hard, isn't it, when she misses things like your school assembly? I know it makes you sad, even when you don't say it out loud." I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to my daughter murmur something too quiet for me to catch, before Renata continued. "I'm always going to be here though, okay? No matter what. I want to be honest that in isolation, that specific exchange could plausibly be read as simple, well-intentioned comfort from a caregiver trying to help a child process a working parent's understandable absence from one specific event. It was the accumulation of similar moments, once I started actively watching for them, that began painting a much more troubling picture. Renata had developed, I slowly realized, a consistent pattern of subtly positioning herself as a more stable, more attentive presence than David or me, delivered through comments that individually sounded innocuous but that, accumulated over months, appeared designed to gradually reshape how our children understood their own family. "Miss Renata always has time to play, unlike when mommy's on her computer," Lucas said once, at not yet 3 years old, in a moment that struck me as far too specific and adult in its framing to have originated entirely from his own 3-year-old observation. I mentioned these growing concerns to David, and together we began a more deliberate, careful process of observation, watching for patterns rather than isolated moments, trying to understand whether what I'd started noticing represented a genuine, concerning dynamic or simply the ordinary, harmless affection young children naturally develop toward a caregiver who spends significant daily time with them. We started keeping a shared, private note on our phones, logging specific comments and moments as they happened, a practice that felt uncomfortably clinical applied to someone we'd trusted so completely for so long, but that ultimately became essential to understanding the true scope of what had been happening. Over those 6 weeks, the log grew to include over a dozen specific incidents, comments about our work schedules delivered with a particular note of sympathy that seemed to invite the children's sadness rather than simply acknowledge it, small comparisons that always positioned Renata's consistency favorably against our own inevitable, ordinary limitations as working parents, and most troublingly, at least 2 instances where Emma repeated back to us, nearly verbatim, phrases about not knowing how long Miss Renata would get to stay, that neither David nor I had ever said or even implied in any conversation Emma could have overheard. What we eventually pieced together, over about 6 weeks of careful, quiet observation, was a pattern that went well beyond ordinary childcare affection. Renata had apparently begun, gradually, framing herself to our children as a more consistently present, more emotionally attuned alternative to David and me, using small, repeated comments that subtly undermined our parenting in ways specifically calibrated to be difficult to directly confront. Never anything overtly negative about us that a child could clearly report, but consistent, gentle reframing that positioned her presence as more stable and more valuable than our own. I want to be careful, in describing this, not to suggest some kind of dramatic, cartoonish villain scheming against innocent children from day one. I think, based on everything we eventually learned, that this dynamic developed gradually, possibly without Renata fully, consciously acknowledging to herself the cumulative effect of what she was doing. The same way the financial diversions appeared to have started small and modest before gradually escalating into something far more extensive than any single decision point might have suggested at the outset. The full picture only became completely clear about 2 months after Emma's initial comment, when David, prompted by our growing unease, finally conducted a genuinely thorough review of the household account activity spanning the preceding year, the kind of careful, line-by-line scrutiny that had lapsed during the months of accumulated trust that had made Renata's gradual financial diversion possible in the first place. I remember David calling me at work, his voice tight with a controlled panic I rarely heard from him. "Sarah, I need you to come home. I found something in the account records, and I think it's much worse than either of us has been imagining." What David had discovered, laid out across nearly a year of transaction history once he finally examined it with proper attention, was the full extent of the financial diversion, the pattern of fabricated repair invoices, the inflated grocery discrepancies, the increasingly vague cash withdrawals, all totaling just over $87,000 over roughly 10 months of gradually escalating theft. We confronted Renata that same evening, after the children were asleep, in a conversation that remains one of the most difficult of our entire marriage. She didn't immediately confess, initially offering explanations for individual transactions that sounded plausible on their surface, but that, laid against the full pattern David had documented, quickly became impossible to sustain. David laid the printed transaction records on our kitchen table, the same table where Renata had shared countless meals with our family over 2 years, and walked through them methodically, one by one. This repair invoice, we called the contractor directly this afternoon. He has no record of ever working on our water heater. This grocery discrepancy, 3 weeks running, doesn't match any receipt you've given us. Renata, I need you to explain this, honestly, right now. She sat very still for a long moment, her composure visibly cracking in a way I'd genuinely never seen from her across 2 years of consistently calm, capable presence in our home. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I can explain some of it," she said. "Not all of it makes sense even to me, looking back. I want to understand everything." I told her, my voice shaking despite my effort to remain composed. "Not just the money. I need to understand what's been happening with the kids, the comments Emma's been making, the way both of them talk about you compared to us lately." Renata was quiet for a long moment before finally, haltingly, beginning to explain, not a full confession exactly, more a gradual unraveling of justifications that revealed, piece by piece, the shape of what had actually been happening over the preceding year. "I've been going through a really difficult time," she said. "My own situation, financially, has gotten harder than I ever let on to either of you. And I think, somewhere along the way, being here, being the person your kids relied on most consistently, started to feel like something I needed to protect, not just professionally, but for myself too. I know that's not an excuse for the money. I don't have a good excuse for that. But I think, without fully realizing I was doing it, I started making sure they saw me as someone whose presence in their lives mattered too much to lose." I want to describe what it felt like, hearing that explanation, understanding that our children's caregiver had been simultaneously stealing from us financially while emotionally repositioning herself in our children's understanding of their own family, apparently motivated by a tangled combination of genuine financial desperation and a kind of possessive insecurity about her own value and stability in our household. We terminated Renata's employment immediately, that same night, and contacted our attorney the following morning regarding both the financial theft and, after consulting with a child psychologist about how to appropriately address what had happened, the more complicated emotional dynamic she'd apparently cultivated with Emma and Lucas over the preceding months. The financial resolution, while emotionally exhausting, was relatively straightforward from a legal standpoint. Clear documentation of the diverted funds supported both a criminal complaint and a civil claim for recovery, and Renata, faced with unambiguous evidence, ultimately agreed to a restitution arrangement rather than contesting the theft charges directly. Though the actual process of recovering the full amount has, similar to other situations like this, moved slowly and remains only partially complete even now, over a year later. The emotional untangling with Emma and Lucas took considerably longer, and in some ways, remains an ongoing process even now. Our child psychologist, a thoughtful, careful woman named Dr. Alvarez, helped us understand that young children don't process this kind of relational manipulation the way adults might expect. Emma, in particular, struggled for months with a confusing, layered grief that mixed genuine, uncomplicated affection for someone who had been a consistent, warm presence in her daily life for 2 years, alongside a daunting, difficult understanding as she got slightly older and we worked through age. Appropriate conversations with Dr. Alvarez's guidance, that some of what Renata had told her hadn't been entirely honest. It's important not to frame this as Miss Renata was evil and only ever pretending to care about you, Dr. Alvarez advised us early in the process. The genuine care was very likely real, alongside the manipulation and theft. Children can hold complexity better than we often give them credit for, but it needs to be introduced carefully, honestly, without either demonizing someone who was genuinely important to them or minimizing the real harm in what she did. We worked with Dr. Alvarez over several months to help Emma, especially, process a more nuanced understanding that Miss Renata had cared about her in real ways and had also made very serious, harmful choices that hurt our family, and that both of those things could be true simultaneously, a lesson in complexity that felt, at times, almost too sophisticated for a 6-year-old to fully absorb, but that Dr. Alvarez assured us was important to introduce honestly rather than oversimplifying in either direction. One of the harder sessions involved Emma asking, directly, whether Miss Renata had ever actually loved her, or whether all of it was just pretend so she could take our money. Dr. Alvarez handled that question with a gentleness I still think about often, explaining to Emma, in age-appropriate language, that people can genuinely care about someone while also making very wrong, hurtful choices, and that neither of those truths cancels the other one out completely. Emma sat with that answer for a long time, and eventually said something that broke my heart and reassured me in almost equal measure. I think I still miss her, and I'm still mad at her. Is that okay? Dr. Alvarez told her that was exactly okay, that both feelings were allowed to exist together, and I remember thinking, watching that exchange, that my daughter was working through a piece of emotional complexity that many adults struggle with their entire lives. Lucas, being younger, processed things somewhat differently, less through direct conversation and more through a temporary regression in some of his behaviors, increased clinginess, and a brief return to sleep difficulties he'd otherwise outgrown months earlier. Dr. Alvarez reassured us this was a fairly typical response for a child his age experiencing a sudden, unexplained change in a consistent caregiver relationship, and that patience, consistency, and extra reassurance from David and me would likely resolve it over time, which it eventually did, though it took nearly 4 months before Lucas's sleep fully stabilized again. It's been just over 14 months since everything came apart. We've since hired a new nanny, a warm, experienced woman named Cheryl who came to us through a much more rigorous vetting process than we'd originally used with Renata, including significantly more structured financial oversight for any household responsibilities we've extended to her, along with a level of ongoing, attentive engagement with our children's daily experiences that we've committed to maintaining regardless of how much trust develops over time. David and I have talked extensively, in the time since, about how completely our own accumulated trust had allowed both the financial oversight and the emotional dynamics with our children to slip beneath the level of attention they actually needed, not because we were negligent parents in any obvious sense, but because trust, once established, has a natural tendency to reduce the scrutiny we apply to the people we've extended it to. Exactly the dynamic that made Renata's gradual escalation, on both fronts, possible for as long as it was. We've since implemented what Dr. Alvarez, half-jokingly, but with genuine underlying seriousness, called structured trust, with Cheryl and with any future caregiver we bring into our home. Regular, brief check-ins with the kids specifically designed to surface how they're actually experiencing their daily care. Monthly financial reviews David now conducts with genuine, careful attention rather than the cursory glance that let Renata's diversions accumulate unnoticed for so long, and a general family culture, still developing, of talking more openly about what's happening during the hours David and I aren't present. Rather than assuming that consistent, competent performance over time automatically means ongoing vigilance has become unnecessary. Emma still occasionally mentions Miss Renata, usually in the context of a specific happy memory, a particular game they used to play, a story Renata used to tell at bedtime, and we've worked hard, with Dr. Alvarez's guidance, to let Emma hold on to those genuine positive memories without either forcing her to discard them entirely or pretending the larger situation didn't cause real, lasting harm to our family's trust and finances. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted deeply with your children or your finances was quietly reshaping your family's reality while also taking advantage of you financially, I want to hear how you navigated helping your kids process it afterward. I used to believe that hiring someone with excellent references and 2 years of consistently good performance meant the trust one extended was fully earned and permanently safe to maintain without ongoing scrutiny. I've learned, in the hardest possible way, that even genuinely warm, competent caregivers can be dealing with their own unaddressed struggles that eventually surface in ways that quietly, gradually harm the very family they're also, in some real sense, genuinely caring for.